Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is the donor conference that Egypt is planning and hosting on October 12th. It will be a collection of countries, agencies, cooperating in the rebuilding and rehabilitation of Gaza. And that in and of itself, those are words that are important, rebuilding and rehabilitation. Now, there is real doubt and real skepticism about this process. It all stems from Hamas, actually. Hamas is the root of all of the issues of building, rebuilding, and rehabilitating Gaza. In brief, leaders and countries who want to help Gaza are expressing real doubt that Hamas will not be involved in the rebuilding, or will be involved in the rebuilding. They do not want Hamas involved, period. The reason for this is because Hamas has sworn to continue their battle against Israel. Now, just to explain this, the Deputy Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority, Mohammed Mustafa, described it in quintessential terms. He explained that the donor countries are reluctant to give aid to any government where Hamas is involved. Now remember, this is the PA, Deputy Prime Minister, who's speaking here. Mustafa actually is educated at GW, PhD at GW in economics. So Mustafa said that the countries see Hamas as destructive, and that any rebuilding undertaken by Hamas would be done in order to launch another attack against Israel. So Mustafa is sort of paraphrasing what the donors are saying to him, that Hamas is not interested in rebuilding for the sake of rebuilding, but rather for the rebuilding for the sake of striking again. So Mustafa explains that donors want Abbas and the Palestinian Authority to take control of Gaza. But you remember, they were thrown out in the bloody coup in 2005. And here's the quote by Mustafa. He says, "Some donor countries are concerned because of the atmosphere on the ground, because the reconstruction is not possible without enabling the Palestinian government to take the lead in all aspects of life in Gaza." Donor nations do not want to be complicit in sponsoring another Hamas-led conflict between Israel and Gaza. Egypt, let's say, for instance, understands that. They are hosting the conference. They are there in order to rebuild Gaza, but not with Hamas. They are dead set against Hamas. So Egypt is calling the conference to be held in Cairo on October 12th. They will help raise money and allocate the money to rehabilitate Gaza. Rehabilitation means not just the rebuilding of it, but actually the transformation of it back into a healthy environment. And so certainly, one of the chief questions under discussion at the conference will be, who will direct, who will supervise, who will monitor all the money that's coming in from the donors and the agencies. The building itself is hugely important, but just building is not enough. It's building and actually being able to quantify where funds are going, where building supplies are going, and that it's funneled into Gaza construction, not into tunnels and tunnel construction. Egypt has a vested interest in this, in knowing that the money does not go to building and repairing new tunnels, repairing old ones, building new ones. Tunnels from Gaza into Egypt have been responsible for hundreds of Egyptian deaths at the hands of Gaza terrorists. Weapons that came in from Gaza into Egypt, and terrorists themselves who made their way from Gaza into Egypt itself. Those that were trained in Gaza. Egypt knows and understands this. So Egypt will be absolutely certain that the money and the work in Gaza will not be abused. The donors believe that they will be supporting the next Gaza conflict with Israel if Hamas is involved. And they do not want to do that. Donors do not want another conflict in 2 years. From their point of view, they've already supported a conflict every 2 years. 2 years, 2 years, 2 years. Are they going to allocate money for another 2 years to create another conflict in terms of lives, in terms of expenses, in terms of everything? They don't want that. One of the examples that's showing us and showing the donors themselves that Hamas is not interested in rebuilding for the sake of rebuilding is their continued destructive paths in both information as well as physical information. In other words, Hamas is rebuilding their tunnels, and they've made it very clear that that's what they want to do. Just weeks after the ceasefire between Israel and Gaza, the ceasefire goes into effect, and lo and behold, Hamas began rebuilding tunnels again, rebuilding and building new ones, recreating the old ones. Recently, a report was published in the Hebrew press quoting a source, an actual Hamas leader, saying that the Hamas development, Hamas infrastructure, has started rebuilding the tunnels. He said that weapons and other important supplies, including building supplies, are coming in and being smuggled into Gaza from Egypt. We know that he's telling the truth. Why? Because he has no interest in lying. There's no reason to doubt him. The supplies must be small because the tunnels they are using from Egypt are small. Because Egypt destroyed all the big ones, not just according to that, but according to Hamas itself. Now you see, when the Israeli press reports on Hamas, it can reasonably be called speculative, because even if they have intelligence reports from the army or from the intelligence services, they're still speculating. But when Hamas officials describe their actual tunnels, the materials that they're smuggling, that can be seen as confirmation of our understanding. So there's no question that Hamas is rebuilding, and there is no doubt that they want to strike Israel again very soon. And we know this for a lot of points of view. The biggest no doubt about it, is that Hamas understands that this will put into question both the international aid that they're supposed to be getting, that they've been promised to receive, as well as the promise of their unity government with Abbas and the Palestinian Authority. They do not care. The bottom line is Hamas does not care, period, about these issues. Hamas has one major objective. They are what we would call monodimensional. Hamas wants to destroy Israel, period, end. And this is something which is critical for us to see at this point in our stage, in our analysis, that even the donors who are enormously supportive of Gaza, enormously supportive of the Palestinians, enormously supportive of rebuilding, see the frightening reality of what Hamas means. And because of that, if donors are frightened and countries are frightened, they are not going to donate. That frightens me, because it creates a really ugly situation in Gaza itself and with Israel. But Israel is preparing for this potential eventuality. And that, you should know, is enormously important, because that will allow Israel to respond appropriately if Hamas launches another strike against Israel itself. Coming up next, points of view. Here's what some important voices have been talking about. And we're talking about columns and op-eds, of course, the things published in those papers on the other side of the editorials. The first column up is entitled, Palestine Needs Better Friends, and it's written by David Feith. Now, it's published in the Wall Street Journal on September 2nd, 2014. Feith is an editorial page writer for the journal based in Hong Kong. He was an op-ed editor, actually deputy assistant op-ed editor, pretty far down. He's a young man of the journal. And previously, even before that, he was at Foreign Affairs magazine, which is an enormously important magazine dealing with deep issues of what's going on in the world. Feith's thesis is pretty simple, but it's going to be hard to swallow for a lot of people. The thesis says the following: people do not honestly and clearly portray or see Palestinian politics or Palestinian leaders, but rather they morph them into victims and disregard their brutality and hatred towards one another and towards Israel. And they are to blame for their sorry situation right now. So Feith is sort of suggesting that the Palestinian situation that exists today is due to Palestinian leadership as well as their friends who are not seeing the true side of the Palestinian polity and politics. So here's how he begins. He begins by saying the Palestinian cause has attracted international sympathy for decades. So why do the Palestinians still suffer so grievously, he asks. He continues, the burdens of Israeli occupation aren't the full story. Palestinians suffer from bad leaders and bad friends who do more harm than good. Supporters of Palestinians are more like enablers, choosing to ignore the terrorism and the tyranny that have wrecked Palestinian politics. I think that's an enormously powerful statement. And Feith continues to prove his point by drawing on the late Columbia University professor Edward Said, who was actually himself a major spokesperson and thinker for Palestinians and the Palestinian cause. Said, says Feith, created a word that describing people who morph the Middle East into simplistic or cartoonish characters. He called it Orientalism. And what was interesting is it's based on the science of Orientalism, which is a whole other issue. And then Feith concludes, using this Orientalism, from Said, where he brings together this concept of morphing or cartoonish reality, where things are just extreme one way or the other. This is how he concludes. He says, neo-Orientalist thinking treats both Palestinians and Israelis unfairly. A better approach would expose and reject the terrorist thugs claiming the mantle of nationalist movement that deserves accountability and sobriety from its leaders. Then, popular discussion of the Middle East may regain some humane sense of right versus wrong, right and wrong, and the Palestinians may finally achieve security, prosperity, and statehood. And that's how he ends. In reality, Feith is brilliant in this simplistic analysis. Brilliant because he says, just a moment, because of our oversimplification, we have converted the Palestinian leadership and the Palestinian cause into simply good all the time, and we have not criticized them. And that's a problem. Second column up is simply called Steve Sotloff. The column ran in Le Monde Diplomatique, the English edition. The essay is written by a character named Glenn Johnson. Now, he is a writer in the Middle East and on the Middle East. He's headquartered in Cairo. Johnson is originally from New Zealand, and Johnson knew Sotloff very well. They traveled together, they drank together, and this piece is actually a dedication to Stephen Sotloff from a friend. There is little doubt that Sotloff was a remarkable person, not just because of his chosen profession and what he did. Let's look at this example. He actually fasted while imprisoned by ISIS on Yom Kippur. Can you imagine that? On Yom Kippur itself, in the midst of his imprisonment and torture and everything else, he fasted. How did he even know it was Yom Kippur is interesting in and of itself. But he did that. He did that despite his captors. He didn't eat, and he claimed he feigned illness, that he was sick at the time. So as a result, he wouldn't eat, but rather observe the fast day of Yom Kippur. He prayed towards Jerusalem regularly. How did he know which direction Jerusalem was? He saw which direction his captors prayed in, which was toward Mecca. So the Muslim people who took him prisoner prayed towards Mecca, so he prayed in the opposite direction. That was a classic example. In Hebrew, we call that dafka, because they did this, I do this. And that's exactly how we see this example with regard to Sotloff. Johnson describes being with Sotloff in Istanbul. just before Satlov went off to Syria, where he was captured. Johnson begins the essay by saying, "I was with Steve in Istanbul last year. We were talking to a British Special Forces veteran who was sunk in drink, knocking back beers, one after the other. He was now moving stuff into Syria. And the kinds of things he was moving in, by the way, just as an aside, were iPads and walkie-talkies and all kinds of mechanisms to allow for communications." So Johnson then continues, "The guy just wasn't shutting up, and Steve was all ears. You should know, just as an aside, it's important, very often, over a beer or a cup of coffee, these kinds of special people, special ops, can divulge almost every secret thing that they're talking about, because they're so excited about talking about the issues that they're working on." Johnson then says, 6 weeks later, he was kidnapped in Aleppo province. Johnson explained that Steve Satlov wanted the public to understand global events. Johnson describes the human side of Satlov. He describes his hotel rooms, I should say. Johnson says, quote, "His hotel rooms were disaster zones." Then he describes candy wrappers, flak jackets, laptop cords, printouts of long pieces from academic journals, and a bottle of whiskey. Of course, we know what journalist is at home without their bottle of whiskey. Johnson ends in the following way, and this is really the tribute to Satlov. He says, "The men who murdered Steve are of little importance here. In his last moments, as throughout his life, Steve stood in absolute opposition to them, embodying morality and dignity. That's a power his killers are incapable of understanding." Johnson is 100% correct. A true tribute. Satlov was a hero, a Jewish hero. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. The first cartoon I want to talk about is by Robert Ariel. It was published September 10th, 2014. It describes this spectacular sight, a interchange or a juxtaposition between two issues. An enormous tank, which reads ISIL on it, rolls past a tiny Al-Qaeda recruiting stand, and on its way to the Caliphate. The road sign says Caliphate, the place where this ISIL will create their state. Behind the stand is actually Ayman Zawahiri, the current leader of Al-Qaeda, the successor of Osama bin Laden. The tank splashes them, the stand and Zawahiri, with mud. The highway sign says Caliphate, and the recruiting sign reads Ayman's Al-Qaeda recruiting station. And then join the 9/11 team. The cartoon is hilarious. It focuses on the tension between ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Who has the momentum right now? And when you think about who has the momentum, you could see it's obvious. Who has more money? ISIS. Who has more recruits? ISIS. Who's getting more international press? ISIS. Al-Qaeda is on the ropes here for the very same recruits. And as a result, we're seeing tension between Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Maybe we'll actually see more violence between Al-Qaeda and ISIS like we were seeing in Syria. That might emerge also. That actually is good. Internicide is very, very important in terms of understanding this. The next cartoon, cartoon number 2, is by Mike Keefe. It was published on September 3rd, 2014. It's a Kegel cartoon. Keefe is a remarkably talented cartoonist, actually winner of the Pulitzer Prize in 2011. What we have here in this particular cartoon is a murderer, an executioner, with a dripping saber and black clothing. And the clothing actually says, and the character says, he says actually ISIS on it. And in his bubble which says, "We reject Western modernity," he says. And then behind him, filming the whole thing, are two terrorists. They're filming it. And one says to the other, "Now, Get that message out on YouTube. The incongruity is hilarious and yet very sad at the same time. Why? Because ISIS needs social media to frighten the masses. That's their agenda. The agenda of ISIS is to make sure that you can frighten millions of people by killing one person. It's a credo of terrorists across the world. And this particular cartoon shows exactly what we're talking about. They reject Western ideals, but accept Western technology all the time and use it as a tool to achieve their ends. The third cartoon is by Steve Breen, August 21st, 2014, from the UT San Diego. It's a Creators Syndicate piece, but it was published in UT San Diego. UT San Diego was actually renamed in 2012. It stands for Union Tribune, a merger, which merged in 1992. And that merged, that was a merger between the San Diego Union and the San Diego Evening Tribune. The San Diego Sun merged then later on with the Evening Tribune, and then it gets all put together one after the other after the other. What's interesting in the whole story is not that. What's interesting is not the mergers, but actually the story that comes out in San Diego, which is now really a one-paper city, which is sad. That's the story in almost every city in the country now. The cartoon is like this. There are two cartoons in one. The first cartoon has ISIS, a terrorist, holding a bloody knife, and above it is written cancer. And you see the image of a gun in someone's hands next to him. It says cancer above it. The other image is of the same people, just in a wide angle, right? In the wide angle, and you see a cruise missile with a U.S. flag on it heading to strike them. And above them is written surgery. In a moment, my own perspective and a few predictions. I want to think out loud with you now and give you a sense of what I'm thinking and what I'm predicting in terms of the future. The United States is deeply concerned that Jordan is in the sights of ISIS. So the United States has charged a former CIA official with extensive links to Jordan to head up a special task force. The King of Saudi Arabia also announced that he predicts that Jordan is next. And you should note, just as an aside, Saudi Arabia is right after Jordan. There is no reason to worry, though. ISIS has made it clear that they are on the move, which means they are searching for new targets, new places, new land, new space, reuniting their historic swath of property. They have a vision, and they are setting out to accomplish it. So you don't have to worry. They're telling you the truth. We now have to try to stop it. The U.S. wants to develop real responses to potential ISIS threats against Jordan. They need to focus and to figure out what Jordan can do and what the United States must do. Jordan cannot fall to ISIS, not simply because Jordan's role and friendship with the U.S., but because Jordan borders Israel. And if ISIS breaks into Jordan through that border, that would mean, through the border with Iraq, it would mean a game changer. You can actually see on the map, it's very clear. It's so clear. Israel will not tolerate ISIS that close. They cannot tolerate ISIS that close. So listen clearly. If ISIS breaks into Jordan, Israel will strike ISIS immediately. It is simply too dangerous for the very existence of Israel itself. Israel's border with Jordan is not like the border with Syria and the Golan Heights. In the Golan Heights, Hezbollah is defending the region to make certain that ISIS doesn't take over. Jordan doesn't have that same capability as Hezbollah has. Yes, Jordan has a professional army, and they have trained officers. But the Jordanians have no real experience in this, and they are not prepared for the real battle against the enemy like ISIS. Everyone is worried about Jordan, and the U.S., Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan itself are creating a response to that threat. There is real reason for worry about that issue. So I predict that unless they are stopped, ISIS will prance into Jordan. But know this, ISIS can be stopped. We've thought out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@shalomtv.com. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Did you know that Rosh Hashanah as it's referred to, the Jewish New Year, takes place actually in the 7th month of the Hebrew calendar? It's sort of counterintuitive. How could the New Year be in the 7th month? It's not the first month at all. The first month of the Jewish calendar is actually Nisan. Nisan is the month of spring, the month of rebirth, where fresh buds start again. It's the month of life. The month of Passover, which means it's the month of freedom. That's the first month of the Jewish calendar. There are 4 Jewish New Years in the Jewish calendar. The Talmud explains them very clearly in the first chapter of the tractate called Rosh Hashanah. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on Shalom TV.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV on JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.